Oh, no. No stories.
No story?
No, forget the story.
You gotta have a story.
Who says you gotta have a story? It's about nothing.
Well, it's not about nothing.
No, it's about nothing.
Well, maybe in philosophy.
No, nothing happens.
What in the hell is this?
Seriously, has anyone checked on Todd Phillips lately? Has he missed a dose or two?
Is there a ringing in your ears? Are you seeing bright lights or hearing voices? No rational person would do as you have done. Explain yourself.
Or did he get the idea for this film from acting out a real-life version of the Hangover Part 4 movie that we never got from him, but which I would have gladly taken when compared to this absolute dumpster fire of a sequel?
We tend to do dumb shit when we're fucked up.
Joker Folie Deux, if that's how you pronounce it. God-awful title, by the way. Have no idea how that got approved. Then again, stranger shit has come out of Warner Brothers and DC in the past. I don't speak French, Todd, and I sure as hell ain't learning it to understand this craptacular follow-up to what was probably your best movie, at least the ones that I've seen. Doubt I'll be seeing any more, though, because I don't take kindly to having my time and patience pissed on.
Because it insults my intelligence. It makes me very angry.
Joker 2 is easily the most disappointing movie of 2024. No doubt there are worse movies that have come out, and possibly still might since the year isn't over yet. After all, Gladiator 2 is right around the corner. I'll reserve judgment, but I'm certainly not holding my breath on that one. Point is, Joker 2 is bad. Very bad. So bad that I categorize it as being among the worst, but that doesn't mean to say it is the worst. However, what sets this film aside is the fact that, unlike the first Joker movie, this sequel had everything going for it. It was quite possibly one of the easiest slam dunks Warner Brothers could have had after its prequel somehow managed to exceed expectations and managed to succeed against all odds. The first Joker film, while not being the most comically faithful, despite being based on the Joker character from the Batman comics, managed to satisfy many fans of the comic book film genre whilst also breaking through that niche and captivating a much broader audience. And remember, this was despite the media's best efforts to drag the movie through the mud, with such ridiculous notions as the movie would incite violence by glorifying anarchy and mental illness, when that's not what the first Joker film does at all. In actuality, the original Joker film was a psychological deconstruction of the Joker's character, demonstrating how society, through its lack of tolerance and understanding, as well as its ill treatment of those who are in fact mentally unhealthy, can bring about the creation of a monster.
Get what you fucking deserve!
And even though the film portrays the Joker's actions as justice against the rich, pompous, and privileged, who are certainly not portrayed as good people within the movie itself, and definitely deserved some comeuppance, the justice that the Joker delivered was not the right kind of justice. Many people in the world are assholes, but that doesn't give you the right to kill them or take matters into your own hands. The movie's message is pretty clear-cut and dry. Look, the media will always be morons. The general audience, however, understood what the film was actually doing, applauded its execution, amassed a large fan base, and many fans who would eagerly await a sequel. Hence why there was so much hype leading up to the release of the Joker sequel. When it was finally announced, fans were like, fuck yeah, let's go, Joker 2, here we go, baby. And then it was also announced to be a musical too. Big fucking yikes. And seriously, I remained in denial that the film would be a musical right up until I saw it. I honestly thought it was a joke, no pun intended. And then I saw the movie.
If I wasn't there, I wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah, it turned out to be true. And holy hell, talk about a misfire. Granted, that's far from my only issue with this movie, like it appears to be with so many other shallow fucking critics who only seem to focus on the superficial, and God forbid the movie isn't paced out like a Marvel film or a Die Hard movie, and they'll simply start shitting bricks due to a lack of key jangling and explosions on screen. Now look, I'm not against a more artsy approach, we'll call it, towards movies. I actually like to see movies that feel distinct, interesting, with a unique personality, even though it may not align with my tastes, instead of movies that feel like they came off an assembly line or were devised by a fucking committee.
This is the story that Kevin wants.
So I'm not against the idea of a musical, or even a Joker musical necessarily in theory. It all comes down to execution. But the reason the announcement of a sequel being a musical felt so contrived is because of the fact that the first Joker film was certainly far from being anything close to a musical. And it did not garner its praise and mass following by being a musical. Ergo, it's not remaining consistent with its own genre and style by indulging it. Despite much of the style from the original Joker film being kept intact, since Todd Phillips would once again return to write and direct, as well as Joaquin Phoenix's return to reprise his outstanding performance in the first film. You can definitely tell that this movie was made by the same people that worked on the first movie, except in regards to the writing quality, which we'll get to. But then you have new ingredients added to the mix, like Lady fucking Gaga of all people, to play Harley Quinn, who initially puzzled me, like, what the fuck, have they lost their minds? She's gonna play Harley? I hadn't seen A Star Is Born, which was apparently her breakout role as an actor, when she transitioned from her music career. I'd heard good things about it, and to be completely fair, she did a pretty damn good job with what she was given in this film. She's talented, she's got acting chops for sure. But throughout this movie, when you realize just how much of it is centered around music and breaking out into song for minutes at a time without adding anything substantial to the plot, to the point where it becomes an absolute chore, it becomes very obvious why, of all people, Lady Gaga was chosen for the role, and it was without a doubt merely for the musical aspect to satisfy this film's own self-indulgence. So what about the film itself and the story?
Oh no, no stories.
Despite its paper-thin plot, how does it leave the audience feeling about this good faith investment of their time in this film's characters, and the big payoff to the first Joker film that captivated so many? I'll let Hans Moleman answer that question. So what do you say we get started?
And here we go.
The movie starts off with this really odd Looney Tunes parody-style cartoon that was apparently made in-universe as a way of mocking the events of the first Joker film, including the horrific murder of Murray Franklin carried out by Arthur Fleck, aka Joker. Not sure why something so light-hearted and tasteless would have been made about an actual murder that happened on national television, but we come to find out that Joker has amassed quite a substantial following of cultists, and this parody that was meant to make fun of him would only fan those flames. Now granted, this opening cartoon has very little to do with most of the actual movie, and it goes on for entirely far too long. And get used to those 3 words, far too long. Because for a 2-hour and 18-minute movie, there's an astounding amount of filler sequences padding out its runtime that go on for far too long. It then transitions to Arkham Asylum, where Arthur Fleck is currently imprisoned, awaiting the news of whether or not his crimes will be brought to trial, or if he is too mentally ill that he lacks the competence to do so, which would mean he would instead remain institutionalized in psychiatric care. Brendan Gleeson, who has been in many of my favorite movies and is always a welcome acting presence.
Is that a student?
Technically, it's a ferret.
May the gods keep the wolves in the hills and the women in our beds.
He plays one of the main guards at Arkham Asylum who takes something of a special interest in Arthur, by which I mean he humors and mocks him whenever he can. He mentions how Arthur doesn't tell jokes anymore, which is a reference to one of the key aspects of Arthur's character and what he would become in the first movie, when he grew into his Joker alter ego. Which is strange because that is certainly not how we left his character at the end of the previous movie. Remember that because we're going to come back to it. The movie then takes its sweet-ass time as it follows Arthur as he gets dressed and walks slowly through every hall and every corridor throughout Arkham Asylum until he finally reaches the nurse's station where he gets his medication. What does this add to the movie? Barely a fucking thing. And guess what? It took far too long. And then we are treated to a scene where Arthur is given a full shave to look presentable for his lawyer, where the Arkham guards take turns telling jokes to each other, and you guessed it, this scene barely adds anything and takes far too long. And then we get some walking in the rain, walking through corridors until Arthur and his Arkham guards pass a music class where he first locks eyes with Harley Quinn, who we later come to find out is a huge fan of Joker. You'll notice I said Joker, not Arthur. We'll come back to that later. But Arthur, on the other hand, is immediately taken with her. It's about as nice and endearing as you can expect from a love at first sight moment that takes place in a mental institution. And it adds a little something to the film, but you guessed it, this takes far too long. We're now 10 minutes into this 2-hour movie and barely a fucking thing has happened. But you know what? I said to myself, I'm patient. Let's see if the movie picks up from here. Finally, Arthur has a brief meeting with his lawyer who's insisting that he is mentally ill and needs to demonstrate that to his psychiatric assessor who will be evaluating him if he is competent enough to stand trial. She speaks to him as if he and Joker are two different people. She's insisting that he's suffering from something akin to a split personality disorder, and that he adopted the Joker persona to try and cope with his past trauma and childhood abuse. Obviously, an insanity plea is the best bet for her to keep him alive. Arthur is still very subdued at this point and reluctant to showcase that extroverted Joker persona that we left him with at the end of the first movie. He's regressed. He's withdrawn back into Arthur Fleck, but not entirely, because he does give off the vibe that the idea of hiding behind a mental illness is an insult to the freedom he found himself experiencing when he finally let the Joker out at the end of the first movie. But still, watching this for the first time, I remember thinking to myself, it's just, what an odd decision to regress his character back into his shell. And I'm going to come back to this repeatedly. Anyway, after the meeting, Brendan Gleeson tells Arthur that he got him into that music class he seemed to like so much, which was actually quite easy due to Arthur's good behavior, and this allows Arthur to properly meet Harley Quinn. It took 20 minutes just to get him into that damn music class, and barely a thing has happened. When Arthur Fleck meets Harley Quinn properly this time, he's happy to find out that she's actually a Joker fangirl who found herself connecting with him from afar because of his actions in the first movie, just like the rest of the fanatics that he inspired. She tells him about how she was committed by her mother for starting a fire in her own apartment, how she grew up in the same neighborhood as him, and how her upbringing was more or less just as abusive and tragic as Arthur's upbringing was. Which we come to find out is a collection of half-truths or just straight-up lies designed to manipulate Arthur into allowing her to be close with him. Arthur Fleck, sensing a connection, tells her that he killed 5 people, but then he decides to confide in her that he actually killed 6 people, one of which was actually his own mother, which apparently was a secret, since I guess no one was able to tie him to it. I mean, his mother was sick, but like, the timing of her death, which took place in the same week as all of the Joker's other murders, and the fact that Arthur recently stole personal files that belonged to his mother that uncovered a really heartbreaking truth about his past, like, I immediately raised an eyebrow at this because, seriously, how could the prosecution not connect the dots there? You figured he'd at least be under investigation for that, but whatever. Anyway, the two characters bond over tales of murder and arson and anarchy, but something actually stuck out to me about this exchange. See, Arthur, again, has regressed from his Joker persona from the first film back into his depression, and Harley Quinn is once again trying to bring him out of that shell. The problem I had with this is that the ending of the first film paints a completely different picture of who Arthur is. I know it was shown to us that the guards at Arkham have wondered why Arthur has quote-unquote stopped telling jokes, but the first movie ends with Arthur still very much in his Joker persona while at Arkham Asylum, laughing to himself in the psychiatrist's office, who then asks him what's so funny, to which he responds, she wouldn't get it. And then the movie ends with Arthur dancing through the halls of Arkham, trotting blood everywhere, as guards chase him down, because it's outright implied that he killed the psychiatrist because he thought it was funny. Meaning the grand total of people he's killed would have been 7 people, not 6. So, this again makes me think that shortly after the first Joker film was released, plans changed or Todd forgot his meds, which led to the sequel being thrown massively off course from what, if anything, was originally planned. Or maybe they didn't have a plan and were just scrambling to come up with a story for a sequel, and they couldn't come up with anything, so they decided to regress Joker back into Arthur Fleck and pretend that ending never happened. After the music class is over, Joker is escorted to the rec room at Arkham where his fellow inmates are watching the news, and it's become clear that Joker has become a martyr to the unsatisfied citizens of Gotham City and a symbol for anarchy and revolution across the country. Also, Harvey Dent makes an appearance as Gotham City's district attorney, even though I'm pretty sure that Harvey Dent is meant to be around the same age as Bruce Wayne. And the first Joker film shows that Bruce is still a child, and the fact that the second Joker film points out that only 2 years have passed since then, but whatever, I guess. Oh, and then the musical starts. Oh boy. Now look, it's not like the first Joker wasn't without some slightly indulgent musical moments of its own. The scene where Arthur is dancing in the bathroom, showcasing the freedom he experienced when he finally released the Joker and committed his first murder. Or when he's dancing down the stairs after leaving his apartment for the first time in the Joker's suit and makeup, having finally fully embraced his alter ego. And let's not forget that both of those moments in the film are widely praised for how captivating they are. So did Phillips, Warner Brothers, and DC just say, oh well fuck, if the audience likes music, let's just turn the sequel into a fucking sing-along? It honestly wouldn't surprise me if the decision was made by an inept bunch of studio executives who had no idea why they lucked into so much success with the original Joker film, that they just looked at it and decided, yes, more of this. They want musical sequences? By God, they'll get it. And along with that, possibly the biggest misfire in cinema history. If that was the case, what those dumb fucks at Warner Brothers don't seem to understand is the reason why those musical moments in the first Joker work so well is because they were just that. They were moments. And each one of them meant something and added something for the character and the story. They weren't just there for the sake of them. And they didn't disrupt the pacing and drag out a scene every 5 fucking minutes. Like, sure, they were artistic and a little self-indulgent, but that was precisely the point. It was all about Arthur cutting loose and releasing his alter ego without any shame whatsoever. So how about the musical numbers in the second Joker film? Was it worth compromising the style and genre of the film that was set up in the first Joker movie?
No!
And were they worth all that budget and development time that the studio spent on putting them together?
No!
And did they deserve the dozens and dozens of minutes of screen time that were dedicated to them?
No!
Now granted, as far as the second Joker film goes, the first musical number I found to be kind of clever. Because Arthur finally meets someone who seems to understand him and who he can connect with, and then he almost immediately finds out on the news, oh shit, I'm likely going to be put to death. And he's not going to be able to pursue anything with her for very long. So when he breaks out into song, it's all internalized, but then he gets snapped out of it, and the reality sets in, causing him to break down. Most of the other musical numbers, however, were just there to turn Joker 2 into the poor man's Lion King. Like, for instance, when Harley Quinn sets fire to the theater room because she wanted to briefly escape with Arthur so that they could have a romantic moment all to themselves. I'll admit, I did buy into their chemistry. It's more or less what I'd expected from the trailers and what little I do know about the Joker and Harley Quinn's dynamic. But it was completely fine. Hell, good even, without the overindulgent musical aspect of it, which would continue and bleed into just about every single sequence from then on until the end of the runtime. Harley Quinn's little stunt gets her cuffed and escorted back to her cell at Arkham, and for some reason, Arthur is the only one who gets sent to the hole for 2 weeks. Sometime later, he's visited by Harley Quinn, who somehow in a mental asylum convinces the guard, hey, can I visit the same guy I just committed arson and tried to escape prison with? Granted, I don't think they were ever caught for setting the fire, but we come to find out later that Harley Quinn, again, hasn't told Arthur the complete truth, and the truth of the matter is she actually checked herself into Arkham Asylum to meet him, so she's there of her own accord, which I suppose does explain why she doesn't get sent to the hole as well and doesn't face any lasting repercussions. But at the same time, the fact that she's able to move throughout Arkham Asylum so casually was a little hard to suspend my disbelief for. Anyway, Harley Quinn tells Arthur that they're sending her home because he is apparently a bad influence on her. Yeah, no shit, although given everything I know about these two characters, I'm pretty sure it's meant to be the other way around. If anything, Joker should be bringing Harley Quinn out of her shell. And yes, just to reiterate, I'm fully aware that Arthur Fleck is not the traditional portrayal of the Joker by design, and he's more of a psychological deconstruction based on the character. And I understand the whole idea of why he's so miserable in prison is because he's regressed back into his depression state that he was at the start of the first Joker, more or less. But I mean, come on, the first Joker ended with Arthur ready to start an anarchist revolution. You'd think he'd be constantly plotting his escape and trying to indoctrinate other inmates into his line of thinking, but no! Harley Quinn is the one who has to give Arthur a kick in the pants to stop being a pussy and start being the Joker again. I get the idea behind this character shift. It's sound enough on its own, but it doesn't line up all that well with the end of the first Joker film. However, while Harley is visiting Arthur in his cell, she again, somehow, managed to smuggle in some makeup so that she can live out her fantasy of hooking up with quote-unquote the real Arthur. And I shit you not, Arthur Fleck, right there in that cell, boinks Lady Gaga Quinn and manages to pop his very first nut. I knew this was a romance, but I didn't expect him to actually go there with it. Granted, the scene is actually quite tame, but you know what? Good for Arthur. You finally blew your first load in a bitch. Try and make it last more than 20 seconds next time. Before his trial, Arthur is interviewed on television where he answers for his crimes. At first, it seems like Arthur is trying to heed his lawyer's advice, but as the interview goes on, the subject of Harley Quinn comes up, and Arthur decides to break out into song again as it transitions into yet another musical number, which the interviewer allows to go on. And I'm assuming that's because, hey, a crazy guy just started singing for no reason. That'll help ratings, I guess. This musical number is meant as a kind of love letter to Harley Quinn from Joker through the television screen. It again accomplishes and develops nothing, or rather, nothing we didn't already know. And it goes on for, you guessed it, far too long. Anyway, next we're treated to a nice, long car ride into Gotham City. More hallways, more corridors, and more singing. Feeling more than ever like padding at this point in lieu of an actual story. Kind of like the fan service and jokes in Deadpool and Wolverine. It's like they couldn't come up with a story that was deserving of the runtime, so they just padded it out to shit and tried to disguise that with sing-alongs and establishing shots and nice atmospheric tracking shots, but none of it really pushes the plot forward. And it's just fucking empty. Deadpool and Wolverine shares some aspects with Joker 2 in this regard, in that the plot is paper thin, there's barely a story, and most of the fucking movie is made up of filler. But that padding in Deadpool and Wolverine was made up largely of fan service and jokes and graphic violence. Sure, most of it didn't do dick for the plot, and most of those jokes were so current year that half of them are already dated, but in the moment at least, it was entertaining, even if the movie itself was a complete pile of shit. And yes, you bet your ass it was. I'm glad you got a kick out of the fan service, but Deadpool and Wolverine was a discount No Way Home. And much like that film, in fact, aside from some of the fan service, it sucked. And much like Joker, Folie, and Deux, there was barely anything to talk about in terms of a story. Then Harley Quinn briefly starts singing a solo number, and then the trial finally starts, and by now we're just under an hour into the film and barely a fucking thing has happened. I understand that Joker isn't meant to be paced out like a Marvel film, and the film is meant to be a slow and gradual change and development of the character, but for the first half of this movie, I was astounded at how piss-poorly utilized its runtime was. The trial begins with Harvey Dent questioning a psychiatrist on whether or not Arthur actually has mental illness or not. Arthur's lawyer rebuttals, saying that the doctor didn't do a thorough enough job delving into Arthur's background, which has a history of terrible abuse that would have no doubt affected him mentally, or at least that's the story she's trying to push for his defense. Arthur again gives off the vibe that he isn't all that thrilled about his alter ego being truncated down to a sickness, which is only fueled by Harley Quinn's influence, and it seems that Arthur is more fixated on Harley Quinn having a good seat for the courtroom than he actually is on the trial. Now, the whole movie's plot, and I'm using that word very generously here, is built around this big trial, the trial of the century, and what Arthur Fleck's fate will be. Which is fine if they wanted to go that route, but as the film goes on, it feels much less like an actual story being told and More like the writers used this trial as a device that would allow them to just completely rehash the first movie in a way that felt organic. But again, between the musical sequences and bringing back characters from the first film to give a testimony in court, it really feels like they just had no fucking idea what story they wanted to tell. And there was plenty of options available and they just settled on this instead. It comes across as so lazy having half the film dedicated to testimonies from characters just retelling events the audience was privy to from the first movie that amounts to little more than a fucking recap. Which again, this film was welcome to do if it didn't take its sweet-ass, self-indulgent time fucking getting there. The first character we get reintroduced to is Arthur's social worker who recounts what it was like to know him and examine him, detailing accounts from a diary he kept, including his very unfunny jokes, and she insists that Arthur and Joker are indeed the same person, and that she saw little to no difference between the two of them. After the first round of the trial ends, Harley Quinn confronts Arthur's lawyer, telling her to stop portraying Joker as some kind of sickness, that Arthur is perfect just the way he is, etc., etc. The lawyer tells her that he is sick and he seriously needs help. I mean, the entire movie she seems to be looking after Arthur's best interest. I understand it's her job, but I was honestly in disbelief that an attorney would go such the extra mile for a guy who has confessed to multiple murders and committed one on national television. But regardless, all Harley Quinn cares about is Joker's revolution and the quote-unquote fantasy of it all. I'll come back to that later. The lawyer is worried that Harley Quinn is going to jeopardize Arthur's trial, and then she tells him that she hasn't been completely honest with him and that she's fabricated much of what she told Arthur just to get close to him. Arthur doesn't want to hear it because Harley has him wrapped around her finger. I never thought I'd see the day when the Joker was completely whipped. And then the lawyer informs Arthur that Harley Quinn has a degree in psychology, meaning she would know how to manipulate him. Even though, again, it should be the other way around since this is the Joker we're talking about. Or at least it's meant to be. But this is enough to instill doubt and distrust in him about Harley. And Arthur hates dishonesty, remember? Maybe more than anything else in the world. After all, it was the crippling truth his mother kept from him that ultimately pushed him over the edge and drove him to kill her. Back in prison, Arthur mulls over what his lawyer told him about Harley Quinn, who then later comes to visit him. Arthur questions her about how truthfully she's been, but she basically tells him that all she really did was stretch the truth or tell little white lies so that he would accept her. And she also caps it off by telling him that she got pregnant off the Joker load that he shot. And I mean, could you imagine for a second these two as parents? That's a surefire way to help 10-year-old Bruce Wayne cope with being an orphan. Yeah, he lost both his parents, but hey, things could be worse. Harley Quinn immediately transitions into yet another musical number where she starts singing Why Do Birds Suddenly Appear? And honestly, one of the coolest shots in the entire movie, you know, besides walking in the rain and fucking corridors, is when she marks a smile on the glass with her lipstick and the shot lingers until it's blended with Arthur's face, and the mark on the glass turns into the Joker's smile. I thought that was a nice touch. As for the pregnancy, this plotline is all but completely abandoned, and we scarcely hear a fucking thing about it until the end of the movie. And even then, it's completely abandoned. Meaning, again, this scene adds very little to the movie, and it went on for, you guessed it, far too long. Anyway, back to the trial, we get reintroduced to Arthur's imaginary girlfriend from the first movie. She recounts the events of the first film, and admittedly, she does give us a little more of what the relationship was like between Arthur and his mother that we weren't all that privy to in the first movie. How she talked about him behind his back to some of her neighbors, one of which being her. As she continues to give her testimony, you can see Arthur getting increasingly uncomfortable as she talks about how his mother said she couldn't believe Arthur based his whole life on wanting to make others laugh on some garbage line she fed him as a child, how he never had a girlfriend and that he was probably a virgin. And just to pause for a moment, because I've seen some pissed off audience members say that this was meant to spite them through Arthur as a means of taking shot at fans of Arthur's character by making him out to be some kind of incel or whatever, which was meant to represent them. I'm going to be completely honest here, I don't think that was the case at all, because Arthur's background, based on his imaginary girlfriend's testimony, is all true. The testimony is consistent with what we know from the first film, and much to many people's frustration, let's not forget, This film is a 2-hour self-indulgent fucking romance that's centered around Arthur and Harley falling in love with each other. That is, of course, right up until the end, and I'll get to that. Like I said, the purpose of bringing these characters back is simply for a recap, with very little else added to the story. However, hearing his mother's words through his imaginary girlfriend's testimony sends Arthur into a bit of a rage where he breaks out into another musical number where he fantasizes about hijacking the courtroom and killing the judge, and he does this in his full Joker costume and makeup. And I didn't actually mind this particular musical number because it actually added something. Fucking finally! See, the structure of this movie is a musical, meaning, like many musicals, it's paced out to have a talking scene that ends or is interrupted by breaking out into song to tell or emphasize a part of the story. Most of the time, the musical numbers in this film are relegated to being a simple fantasy of the characters, just telling us what we already know or foreshadowing something later on in the film, all while chewing up minutes and minutes and minutes of the film's runtime. And this latest musical fantasy of Arthur is no different aside from the fact that he's finally snapped. He can't take it anymore. He's done putting up with the world and the legal system, and he's finally going to release the Joker and embrace this revolution he started back in the first film. Yah fucking who? The movie is actually going somewhere, or so we thought. See, the whole way through this film, all of Arthur's followers, and hell, even us, the audience, have been agonizingly waiting for Arthur to embrace being the Joker again. Kind of like how through the entirety of The Last Jedi, everyone was waiting for Luke Skywalker to stop being an out-of-character, miserable little shit and become the character the audience knew him as from the George Lucas movies, which he, for the most part, should have started the film as. Much like how we left Arthur as the Joker in the first movie. And at least for the moment, it looks like the film was simply counting on our patience and is now finally laying the groundwork for the big payoff at the end. Not what I would have done, and again, it's a pretty big misfire for how to go about progressing the character, but at this point, I'll take it. So I, like many others I'm sure, were waiting to see the big payoff for Arthur's character. Oh, how wrong we were.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Now granted, it starts off fairly well. Arthur, against all common sense, fires his well-meaning lawyer who has been fighting viciously for him with her case for the insanity plea, but now Arthur says, fuck that, I'm the Joker, and I'm gonna represent myself as the Joker for the rest of the trial. Granted, I'm not sure what the endgame could possibly be other than generating a violent frenzy from his followers that would lead to a revolt against the powers that be and maybe lead to him getting out of prison or whatever. I mean, he and Harley Quinn do sing a musical number about how they are going to, quote-unquote, build a mountain together. That, you guessed it, goes on for far too long. But look, whatever it was, it's still more interesting than 90% of the movie thus far, so my interest was piqued. And hell, when Arthur returns to Arkham Asylum, the place is already on the verge of rioting for him because they see him as a symbol of revolution. Now granted, Arthur is not the traditional portrayal of the Joker character from the comics. It's my understanding that the basic gist of the Joker character is that he's not a revolutionist or anything like that. He's just a madman who commits murder and mayhem for his own shits and giggles. And everything else is just a means to an end for him. And even though Arthur shares some of those attributes, like his demented sense of humor...
You think that killing those guys is funny?
I do. And I'm tired of pretending it's not.
Well, okay, I think I might understand that you did this to start a movement, to become a symbol.
Come on, Murray. Do I look like the kind of clown that could start a movement?
He's also quite different as a character. But Arthur was always meant as a more primitive version of the Joker character anyway, so had creative on this movie been different, maybe he would have eventually gotten there, but regardless, he never intended for this revolution to start in his name, but now he's finally decided to become the symbol these fanatical people want. Even if he doesn't care about them or the cause, it makes him feel special, and he could use it as a means to an end, but whatever his reasons, he's finally going to be the Joker again. The next day in court, we get reintroduced to another Joker alumni character, and this might have been the best scene in the entire movie. The little person, called Puddles, who was the only one who wasn't mean to Arthur at his old job, and who also witnessed Arthur murder one of his own co-workers right in front of him. Arthur, as the Joker, puts on a show for the crowd, and starts questioning Puddles about what he thinks of him, if he's really the bad guy. After all, they both know that the guy he killed was a real bully, so that should justify Arthur's actions, right? But Puddles replies, yeah, he was a bully, but he didn't deserve to die. And then Arthur asks Puddles if he happened to catch the Murray Franklin show later that night. Puddles tells him no, he was at the police station that night because he was the only witness to Arthur's crime, and he was kept there all night scared out of his mind. Arthur then asks Puddles who he sees in front of him right there and then, Arthur or the Joker. Puddles tells him he sees the Joker, but he begs Arthur to stop putting on the charade because it really isn't him. Arthur tells him maybe he just wasn't really looking. And then Arthur proceeds to break out into a tirade about how Puddles is just like all the other people who underestimated him, sounding off on the co-worker he killed, Murray Franklin, and even on national television, mind you. He sounds off on those quote-unquote fat, stupid guards at Arkham.
Very poor choice of words.
They all thought they could treat him like trash, but now the whole world and his followers know him as Joker. And now he's finally not alone. And now he's finally free to be who he truly is. Puddles, who then breaks down crying in court, pleads with him, saying that Arthur was the only one who was ever nice to him as well. And how after what happened, he still can't sleep or go back to his job. And that he feels scared all of the time and powerless because of Joker. Arthur, now visibly shaken at hearing possibly his only friend talk about him that way, abruptly ends the questioning. It was a good scene that showed not only some of the aftermath and consequences of the first Joker movie, but also showcases how a little bit of Arthur still resides within Joker. Or maybe it was the last vestige of Arthur that remained. Personally, I thought when Joker ended the questioning, especially after making that grand speech, that it was him finally turning his back on Arthur for good. It wasn't easy, but he did. Though I suppose that one is up for interpretation. Now later that night, back at Arkham, however, is when the movie really begins to fly off the rails and proceeds to conduct a long series of spiteful dick kicks directed at the audience. Those of which who maintained their investment in Arthur's character up till now. The first thing that happens is the Arkham guards, led by Brendan Gleeson, are royally pissed at the way Arthur embarrassed them on national television, and they proceed to take him to a secluded part of the asylum where no one will interfere with what they have planned, and they proceed to strip Arthur, remove his Joker makeup, beat him, even strongly implied that they sexually assaulted him.
Okay, I'm waiting for the punchline.
There's no punchline. It's not a joke.
Which, okay, my guess is since they had access to his personal files, they know that Arthur was deeply traumatized as a kid, which was at least partially attributed to sexual abuse. So they knew that that would be the easiest and most cruel way to break him. Regardless of what actually happened, it crushed Arthur, and when he gets taken back to his cell, his Joker makeup has been completely removed. He doesn't make a sound, he isn't laughing, and he has no more smile. Meanwhile, one of his fellow inmates, who is also a Joker fan, starts singing When the Saints Go Marching In from down the hallway, which is the song that was being sung when they basically started rioting at Arkham for Joker the previous day. This inmate is trying to make sure that Arthur is okay, and then Brendan Gleeson basically pulls a Shawshank Redemption on the guy, takes the inmate out of his cell, and starts choking him in order to get him to shut the fuck up. But he goes way too far and ends up killing him instead. All the while, Arthur is listening on from the quiet of his cell. Now, because of all this, the next day in court, Arthur decides to rest his defense and then doesn't even continue to put up a fight, and then in his closing statement denounces the Joker, saying that there is no Joker, confesses that he in fact killed his mother too, and then states that he just wants his effing miserable life to be over.
God fucking damn it!
Wow. Okay, so that bullshit subversion is dick kick number one. And it was nothing more than a pathetic cop-out in lieu of actual character progression and storytelling. Arthur had one bad night in prison, so he just completely walks back on this whole Joker persona that he's used to escape the misery of his life. Let's dial it back to the first Joker movie and what he tells Murray Franklin on the show.
I got nothing left to lose. Nothing can hurt me anymore. My life is nothing but a comedy.
Arthur had a lifetime of misery, and the Joker allowed him to come out of all that with a smile on his face. Nothing can hurt him anymore. Well, except for a bad night at Arkham that all of a sudden gives him a reality check and causes him to turn his back on what he now truncates down to a mere fantasy. Like, talk about character assassination. This is not Arthur Fleck, the character, speaking. This is the writers actively telling the audience to go fuck itself for caring and being invested in the character. This is not a payoff for anything. This doesn't leave any kind of fulfillment for the character or the audience. It just leaves us with nothing. That is, except for royally pissing us off. And we were not the only ones, because all of a sudden Harley Quinn gets up and leaves the courtroom, along with several more of the Joker's fanatical supporters, because they felt betrayed by Arthur, like he turned his back on them and the cause. Once this is all over and done with, Arthur Fleck calls Harley Quinn before the verdict was read, which apparently it took the jury less than an hour to deliberate. He tells her how much he wants to see her and make sure she's alright, so again, predictably at this point, he breaks out into song, and I am so past the point of even pretending to care anymore. After that previous scene, 2 seconds was far too long for this phone call sing-along shit. After which, it transitions back to the courtroom where the verdict is read and Arthur has been found guilty as charged on all counts. But before the end of the verdict reading, Arthur then breaks out laughing uncontrollably as he's been known to do, causing a riot in the courtroom where some of the victims' family members try to attack him, but then he's separated from them for a brief moment and then the courtroom gets blown up from an outside explosion. Fucking what? And somehow Arthur, despite being nearest to the explosion, is the only one not killed or knocked out. Well, I guess even paper-thin plot armor is still plot armor at the end of the day. And yes, it turns out some of the Joker's fanatics tried to blow up the courtroom, either to break Arthur out, or just to cause havoc as part of the uprising or whatever. They seem surprised to see Arthur when he stumbles out of the courtroom, shell-shocked and covered in dust, so maybe they did just do it for shits and giggles after all. But now that they've seen him stumbling around, out of handcuffs, they decide to stuff him in a car and rescue him because they see him as their leader. You know, I actually had an inkling that something like this might happen, that Arthur might escape by a plan set by his cult-like followers or Harley Quinn, even though she had nothing to do with this, though it would have made a lot more sense if she did. Regardless, Joker has escaped, and he will, for lack of a better phrase, live to fight another day. Maybe that was the point. He needed to be embraced by his fanatical followers who fought for his freedom, and that's what's going to bring him back to insanity and back to being the Joker. Haha, nope! Dick kick number 2. Arthur, at the very first chance, leaves the safety of his escape vehicle and starts running through the streets in plain view of any onlooking police officers who are likely to come across him. Somehow, he doesn't get picked up by the cops and manages to make it all the way back to his old neighborhood, which is where Joker began and where he did that iconic dance sequence in the first movie. So look, in terms of poetry, I can kind of see where they might have been going with what happens next, but it still doesn't excuse dick kick number 3, where Arthur finds Harley Quinn, presumably waiting for him to show up, while she's all dolled up now in her Harley Quinn makeup, and she's just minding her own business, and Arthur tells her that he escaped and now they can run away together, and she tells him in response that all they had was the fantasy, and that they were never going anywhere together. And then he says, oh, but I'm still the same guy you fell in love with, the same guy who murdered Murray Franklin. Fucking what? So wait a minute, does someone want to tell me what the fucking point of Arthur denouncing the Joker back at the courtroom was, if he's still open to embracing his alter ego and being with Harley Quinn? And hell, Harley Quinn even calls him out on this, repeating the words back to him that, quote-unquote, there is no Joker. Yeah, same, bitch. Same. Just what the fuck is going on? None of this makes any sense. And on top of everything else, her alleged pregnancy is finally brought up by Arthur, who's keen to have the baby with her. And then rather than give him an answer, although maybe it was implied, Harley just starts singing another fucking musical number. Which again, might have meant that there was no baby and that she was just playing him from the start, but I really don't see the point of that. If the whole idea was for her and Arthur to get out of prison so that they could, quote-unquote, build their mountain together, But if she was faking the pregnancy, he would have found out about it eventually and turned on her. So that's just a moronic plan altogether. Anyway, while Harley is singing, what we're all hoping at this point is the last fucking musical number, Arthur pleads with her to stop singing because he doesn't want to sing anymore. And at the end of it all, she just says, "Goodbye, Arthur," and fucks off. Consider my expectations subverted, Todd. What the fuck is this shit?
What were you thinking? What was going on in your mind? You know, you really need some help, but a regular psychiatrist couldn't even help you. You need to go to, like, Vienna or something. Like where Freud studied and have all those people looking at you and checking up on you. That's the kind of help you need. Not the once a week for $80. No, you need a team. A team of psychiatrists working round the clock, thinking about you, having conferences, observing you, like the way they did with the Elephant Man. That's what I'm talking about, because that's the only way you're going to get better.
You wanted a musical. Great. You wanted to sing our fucking ears off for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, instead of focusing on telling a story. Great. You wanted what little there was of a story to be a part of the romance instead of the romance being a part of the story? Great. But now you're basically saying, psych! All that tedious musical bullshit, the romance and everything to do with it, in this movie's absurd 2 hour and 18-minute fucking runtime was completely fucking pointless. This movie has fucking nothing to offer people in terms of fulfillment. Not only did you break Arthur's character and the story, what little there was, you basically sucked the soul out of it. And again, it just leaves the audience feeling completely fucking empty. And not in the good kind of, oh wow, I didn't want it to end, and now I feel so empty, I don't want to go back to reality kind of way. No, this movie makes people feel empty in the worst fucking way possible. But hey, it isn't over yet. Now that Harley has left, maybe Arthur can now stop acting like a whipped little bitch and actually escape to a better tomorrow, and maybe he will re-embrace the Joker persona. Maybe his character arc will be salvaged.
He keeps kicking me in the dick. Why? Why does he keep kicking me in the dick?
Nope, the cops immediately and casually pick him up, place him under arrest, and take him back to Arkham, where the movie started, and once again, Joker has regressed back into Arthur, and the character likely has no chance of escaping. That was dick kick number 4. But hey, Arthur is still alive. Who knows what's gonna happen? By this point, my outlook on the movie was so bleak, I didn't think I could possibly care about what happened next. And although it would have been completely absurd, I was just praying for the Riddler or Mr. Freeze or fucking someone to spring Arthur from Arkham Asylum so that maybe, just maybe, we get a good, satisfying conclusion to all of this, either in this film or possibly a third one, even though they're tripping acid if they think I'd actually pay to see it at this point. But oh boy, I couldn't have predicted what happened next. The grand daddy dick kick of them all.
You'll feel that in a second.
Arthur gets confronted in a hallway by some random Arkham inmate who's clearly a fan of the Joker, who then tells Arthur a joke of his own and then proceeds to casually and gleefully shank him to death. And the film closes out by a lingering shot on Arthur's face as he slowly dies. And that is the end of the film, and what I would think is likely the end of Joker as a whole. I'm going to be frank here. A buddy of mine actually tipped me off about the ending of Joker 2 and Arthur's fate, but I stand by what I said. I couldn't have predicted what happened next, even though in the back of my mind I knew what was about to happen. But much like the dumbfuck idea to turn this psychological crime drama into a fucking musical, I refused to actually believe it. I couldn't believe it until I was actually seeing it, and even then I struggled to.
If I wasn't there, I wouldn't have believed it.
All the superficial aspects of this movie that were superb in the first film carried over to this one. Acting? Stellar. Directing? Stellar. Cinematography? Stellar. Atmosphere? Stellar. Musical score? Stellar. But who fucking cares when the fundamental aspect of that first film, and what made it so great, the writing aspect of it, went from caviar to complete fucking dog shit with utter contempt for its own audience. Now, I've heard theories that Todd Phillips wrote this script as a middle finger to Warner Brothers because he wanted Joker to be a standalone movie that wasn't ruined by subsequent sequels milking it dry. But that makes little to no sense. I mean, that's basically saying Todd Phillips didn't want Warner Brothers to make bad Joker movies, so he decided to make a bad Joker movie that shit all over the previous film that he made all of his own accord. That's completely batshit fucking logic right there. But hey, that's why I was wondering if he'd missed a dose or two. Regardless, he did himself no favors with this film. It's still gonna say written and directed by Todd Phillips on it. It's still going to piss hordes of his own fans and just general moviegoers right the fuck off. It's still going to do terrible box office numbers compared to his first Joker film. And it's just gonna make any studio think twice about ever hiring him again. You know, it's a rare occasion that journalist critics were actually right about this movie. Much in the same way that a solar eclipse is rare. But hey, it looks like they can actually switch on their brains and do their damn jobs when their reviews aren't being paid for by the fucking mouse. I initially waved off their screening reviews. The general consensus of what they were saying is that Joker 2 adds very little to the first Joker movie, the musical feels out of place and tedious, and the ending completely falls the fuck apart. And holy shit, they weren't fucking kidding. That being said, kudos to the media for getting their reviews on just one movie right, generally speaking. Can't say the same for them regarding Deadpool and Wolverine though. And if I could just dial it back a second so that I can explain, despite many of their similarities, why I hate this movie so much more than Deadpool and Wolverine. See, without reiterating too much, Deadpool and Wolverine, like Joker 2, had a paper-thin plot, didn't make a lick of sense, was padded to shit with inconsequential filler. But the biggest difference, however, is that Deadpool and Wolverine was at least trying to give the audience a fulfilling experience, even if it was only a superficial one. Whereas Joker was actively trying to spite their audience at every single turn. They are both awful movies, but hopefully some of you now know what I mean when I refer to some movies as a lovable disaster, such as Deadpool and Wolverine, as opposed to movies that are just a completely miserable experience in just about every aspect, like Joker 2 is. Once more, what's most frustrating about this movie and why it's so massively disappointing is that all the pieces were there. An established character that already has a rapport with a broad and enthusiastic audience, eager to see his chapter 2, and there are likely hordes of source material that this movie could have taken advantage of to tell another chapter of Joker's story that would have been consistent with the first film without regressing the character, instead progressing both him and his story forward. And look, I don't like playing this card because I don't think the audience should ever dictate a story and then get pissy because the story didn't indulge their wishes. That entitled fanfiction horseshit mentality doesn't fly with me. It's not constructive criticism, and it's some of the most petulant, weak-ass sauce you can levy towards any piece of art. However, despite it going against every fiber of my being, what I would have done, and I briefly mentioned this earlier, is I would have had Joker actively try to indoctrinate the inmates of Arkham Asylum, one of those, of course, being Harley Quinn, until he had amassed enough of a following to have the support he needed to break out of Arkham Asylum or take it over and start his revolution in Gotham City. I figured that's what the most logical next step would be for the character and what this movie would actually be going for based on how the first film ended. And I'm only mentioning this because it felt like the writing was on the wall with that one, pun very much intended. But instead they opted to fish the writing out of a garbage dump instead and pass it off as a script. This doesn't mean I'm mad that Todd Phillips, DC, and Warner Brothers didn't do what I specifically was hoping for them to do. They didn't have to do that, they could have done something else, and that is my larger point here. And what I imagine is the root of many people's frustration and disappointment is, they could have done anything they wanted with Joker 2. And they chose to do this instead. They chose to actively destroy what they had set up in the first film at both root and stem with a complete and utter misfire. And hell, they even chose to kneecap their own hard work by shitting all over everything they had set up in the second Joker movie as well. I know what I'm about to say is going to sound incredibly cliche in 2024, because this movie has become pretty much synonymous with the subverting expectations approach to movies. But what this film opted for was very similar to The Last Jedi. And hell, while we're at it, Game of Thrones as well. Which is why the writing comes across as such a massive fuck you to so many audience members. Now, the media and Warner Brothers might actually do a repeat of what happened in 2018, where the blame was solely placed on audience expectations and not getting what they want, which is what much of the backlash towards The Last Jedi was passed off as. But the problem with that is, just like with The Last Jedi and Game of Thrones, those expectations were set up by the writers themselves. And then they just abandoned all their setups for a cheap and empty subversion that makes us feel like we just completely wasted our time. We sat through minutes upon minutes of mostly empty, self-indulgent musical filler for the romance which amounts to nothing in the end. The movie built up to this big crescendo of Arthur taking control of his own fate and re-embracing his Joker persona to ignite the fires of his revolution and pay off the first movie. But that also amounts to nothing, because it was just a fantasy and it was silly buying into it in the first place, which again leaves the audience with nothing. But hey, maybe they're holding out ideas for a third Joker film, which is why they teased it numerous times that Arthur could escape and maybe live to fight another day. Nope, he gets caught, gets sent back to Arkham, and killed in the most casual way possible, and the story just ends. Again, I think some of what's been levied at the film in terms of using Arthur as a stand-in to ridicule incels online is largely projection from certain people. I mean, the film, again, is largely a romance after all, and Joker does get the girl. Again, that is until our expectations become subverted in the most groan-inducing possible way. And hell, this time she isn't imaginary, so I don't subscribe to that mentality on the movie. But what's undisputed is that this film, through its own ego, self-indulgence, and pseudo-intellectualism, pissed on the audience's shoes through cheap subversion in an attempt to be artsy and clever, and just left most people feeling insulted, empty, and like they just wasted their fucking time. And that, above all else, is why Joker 2, Folie, Deux, or whatever the fuck it's called, is the most disappointing movie of 2024. And it's a damn shame. I've heard theories that the only people who wanted this movie were the Warner Brothers higher-ups, but honestly, I highly doubt that. After all, there was still money to be made, an eager fan base waiting for a sequel, and tons of storytelling potential left untapped. If Todd Phillips didn't want to helm the production, he could have easily just passed off the project onto another writer-director, but again, that doesn't explain why the movie is just so self-indulgent and stylized in the way that it is. It looks like Phillips put a lot of genuine care into making this movie, and again, for fuck's sake, he was gifted almost 4 times the budget of the first film, which, at least from a writing standpoint, he helmed with about 1/10 of the competence that he apparently had on the original film. That is, unless this all boils down to Warner Brothers and DC, those meddlesome fucks doing to Joker what they did to the DCEU, and just running into the ground with their incompetence and bullshit. I mean, that seems entirely plausible, but I guess time will tell. Thanks for everyone tuning into this video. Hope it gave you some catharsis. It certainly did me. And if you have any thoughts about what you think happened to this movie and why it was so bafflingly disappointing, be sure to let me know in the comments. But as for Joker 2, thanks for wasting mine and everybody else's time. Go fuck yourself.